Are we ready to roll? Yep. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Cheltenham Borough Council Licensing Committee, which is being held today, Wednesday, the 4th of September 2024. My name is Councillor Dr. David Willingham, and I am Chair of the committee. The meeting is being streamed live to Cheltenham Borough Council's YouTube channel, and the recording of the meeting will be held for 4 years. If there are any breaks in the transmission to the YouTube stream, the meeting will be adjourned for a short period until any technical issues are resolved. Don't have any public present, so we don't need to read that bit. Members will obviously be aware that CCTV and audio recording is now in operation in the council chamber, and those recordings are held for 5 months. A fire alarm test is not expected, so if the alarm does sound, then please make your way to the nearest exit following the green signs. And if you've got a mobile phone that could disturb the meeting, then could you please put it onto silent? So the item number 1 is apologies. Apologies have been received from Councillor Pinniger. Item number 2 is declarations of interest. Does any member have a declaration of interest? I am not seeing any. Item 3 is public questions. There are none. Item 4 is minutes of the previous meeting. And due to the election and the change in membership of the committee, we are going to sign them in bulk. So can I have a show of hands for approving the minutes from the 6th of September 23 and the 7th of March 24 from those who were here? And I think everyone else is an abstention, so I will sign those after the meeting. And then agenda item 5 is minutes of the subcommittee meetings, and again we're going to need to approve those in bulk. Which is the miscellaneous subcommittees held on the 4th of October, the 8th of November, the 6th of December, the 18th of December 23, the 17th of January, the 7th of February, the 3rd of April, the 16th of June and the 11th of July 24. So again, show of hands to approve. Hang on, and there's also alcohol and gambling committees from the 11th of October, the 18th of October, the 20th of February and the 7th of August. So can I have a show of hands to just approve those as well, please? Thank you. Right, I'm gonna run out of ink in my pen, I think, by the time we get through signing those. Right, agenda item number 6, which is the taxi policy review. So could I ask our Head of Public Protection, are you doing this, Louis, to introduce the report, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair and members of the Licensing Committee, the Licensing Committee acts as lead consultee to the Cabinet member responsible for licensing, Councillor Victoria Atherstone. In that capacity, as lead consultee, the committee always has the opportunity to respond to licensing consultations as and when they happen. And the first report is giving the Licensing Committee an opportunity to consider the proposed changes to the authority's taxi and private hire licensing policy, and to make any recommendations or comments for further consideration by Cabinet in the near future. So the recommendations is for the Licensing Committee to note the proposed revisions as outlined in this report and to provide formal recommendations and responses to the Cabinet member for safety and communities in relation to the policy consultation. So just by way of brief background, the authority's substantive licensing policy for taxis and private hire vehicles was adopted in March 2018. Since then, there have been a number of minor and technical changes made to the document. This consultation is since 2018 the first substantial proposed revisions to the taxi licensing policy. It is worth noting that licensing requirements in relation to drivers and operators are largely based on common standards that we've adopted around the county, but the issue of vehicle licensing remains solely at the discretion of individual district authorities, because there's quite a lot of disparity between the types of vehicles that different local authorities within the county will allow for licensing, etc. So the substantive nature of this consultation really relates to vehicle licensing, not drivers and operators, because it's already covered by common standards. At section 3 of the report, there's a breakdown of the proposals as outlined in the consultation. I'm happy to go through them, Chair, or we can take them as read. I don't know, would save time, but
Happy for you to go through them. I think it's useful to get that on record.
yeah, okay, that's fine. So a number of these are fairly technical changes that doesn't require any level of input really. But so working away from the top, so we are proposing to change the policy so the requirement for licensed drivers to display approved information advising passengers how they can submit complaints or comments, and that will effectively just be a QR code where it's visible to passengers, where they can scan the code and get straight to a form where they can submit information to us. It's just really, we get a lot of complaints about things being left in a taxi, or and people can make complaints about taxis, but they don't know which taxi they were in. They don't know the driver, they don't know the badge number. So this is just really to facilitate that process. So it makes it easier to identify issues in the drivers and the vehicles involved, so that we can act on those. We're proposing some technical changes to the way DBS checks are undertaken, but again, that's a very technical issue. That doesn't really require any input. It's just a clarification. We're proposing to change the frequency of medical assessments the drivers undertake in line with the best practice guidance that was issued not long ago. So this just brings this in line with the best practice guidance. So essentially, drivers at the moment will do a medical every 3 years when they have to renew their license. This will bring it in line to have it every 5 years until they reach a certain age, and then it becomes more frequent. So there's proposals on clarification about the top lights. So members will know taxi, they'll have a big sign that says taxi. So this just brings some changes in. We've had for a number of years had complaints from taxi drivers that the old style was quite old and wasn't very aerodynamic and stuff. So we're just implementing some changes to make the signage a bit more modern and small and affordable for drivers. We're proposing to lessen the burden on taxi drivers in relation to taxi meter tests, so they don't have to test their taxi meters as often. So we're only requiring them to certain moments, for example, on renewal every year, they have to provide us with a calibration certificate for the taxi meters. We're proposing to do away with that, so that only when they replace their vehicle and they fit a new meter, at that point, we would require them to provide us with a calibration certificate, and where, for example, we change the fare and the meters need calibrating to the new fare. We also, so at the moment, if a taxi or a private hire vehicle wants to renew their license, they can do their MOT and fitness test up to 2 months in advance of submitting the application. We want to bring that back a month, because 2 months is quite a long period between MOTs, and a lot of things can happen in 2 months, just to make sure that that sort of margin is less, so that we don't end up with MOTs 2 months out of date by the time they make the application. We've already done the roof dimensions. I skipped that. It's a temporary. So we're just providing some clarification on temporary replacements for vehicles. So when a taxi is involved in an accident, replacement insurance companies will temporarily license vehicles whilst the insurance matters are sorted. So we're just clarifying the expectations so that insurance companies understand clearly what the requirements are for vehicles to be licensed. So we're also proposing to implement a requirement that from January next year, all taxi meters must be calendar controlled, which effectively means that they just automatically change, with the different rates and stuff. There's no scope for drivers to tamper or change or manually manipulate the meters so they overcharge customers, etc. We're proposing to implement safeguarding training for directors or people of influence and private hire operators, so the Star Lines and the big operators. So at the moment, all licensed drivers have to undertake mandatory safeguarding equality training. Booking staff also have to, because they've open to sensitive information about where people live and how people travel and whether people's homes are empty when they go on holiday. But we're trying to step the requirement up so that people with influence or directorship in those companies also have an appropriate level of safeguarding awareness and equality awareness. So we also clarifying this is circumstances when we would expect a driver to use a first aid and fire extinguisher, essentially when they're competent and trained to do so. It's available for people to use, but we're clarifying that we don't expect them to use it if they're not competent or trained, but they might make it available to people who might be. And this might be the issue that will probably attract most of the comments. We're proposing to implement a card payment policy for all our licensed vehicles. At the moment, people can pay by cash, they can pay by card, but it's very inconsistent if you turn up on the taxi rank. Some will take cards, some will take cash, some will refuse your fare because they don't want to take cards. So it's an issue that crops up quite often, and we get a lot of complaints about people whose journeys were refused because they wanted to pay by card and taxi only wanted cash, and vice versa. So we're proposing to implement a policy where all licensed vehicles must be capable of taking card payments. And just do away with the issues around cash and card and not being able to stop at ATMs and all of that. And then there's just some proposals around medical exemption. So at the moment, if you drive a wheelchair accessible vehicle, you are under statutory duty to provide reasonable assistance, etc. But some drivers may have medical reasons why they can't provide, my back problems, which means they can't push a wheelchair up a ramp, for example. So there is a process in law where they can be exempt from those requirements. So we're just making some changes to for example, remove the requirement for occupational therapists or occupational health to be involved. And we can just rely on GP information, for example. So we're just lessening the burden on taxi drivers. Then finally, and this is a lot more complicated, the issue of wheelchair accessible vehicles. The authority had a policy where all licensed taxis, not private hire vehicles, taxis that work off the rank and can be hailed, etc., had to be fully wheelchair accessible by a certain date. In December 2021, the cabinet member postponed that policy because they wanted to do further consultation and engagement with the trade. An interim policy was put in place, which we're still functioning under because we're now proposing to change that. So this policy consultation is looking to replace the interim policy position with a permanent policy position. We did some engagement with residents and disability groups who actually said to us that they prefer a mixed fleet because not all disabilities are the same, and not everybody finds it easy, for example, to get into a wheelchair accessible vehicle because they're slightly higher to step up into, and other people prefer saloon type vehicles. And what's had changed since then as well, the Department of Transport's best practice guidance come out, and in there it also says, and I quote, a truly inclusive transport system is one where a mixed fleet is available. So we started in the position where we wanted all our taxis to be wheelchair accessible vehicles. That has slightly changed because of our engagement and the government guidance. So we're now moving towards a policy approach where we will retain a mixed fleet at an appropriate proportion. So we'll ensure that all new cars will need to be wheelchair accessible vehicles. Existing WAVs will be existing saloon type vehicles or non-wheelchair accessible vehicles will be able to retain those licenses. So it will then allow us to maintain a mixed fleet, but ensure there's a proportion of wheelchair accessible vehicles for those passengers who need access to a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So that's generally the sort of the proposals we're consulting on. And it's just an opportunity for members to put forward any thoughts that they might have in relation to that.
Thank you very much, Louis. Does any member have any comments? So I've got Councillor Harvey, Councillor Steinhardt, and then Councillor Wheeler.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if Mr. Crogg could just confirm for me, please, which body of consultees were in favour of having a multi-access fleet? Because you said that the public were consulted and disability groups. It's a matter of public record. My daughter uses a powered wheelchair, so and we have a WAV for our private use. Previously to having a WAV, we did use the one wheelchair accessible vehicle that was available in the county, which was a private hire from Tewkesbury. But I'm interested to know, I know not all disabilities are obvious, but wheelchair users and their need for access is obvious, because you can see the chair and you can see the person sitting in it. So I'm interested to know the balance of responses from the consultees, because people who don't need access to a WAV will be indifferent. So I'd be really interested to know what the disability groups felt about this, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so we do use the Disability Forum that you'll probably be aware of as a sounding board for these sort of types of consultations, but it was also a general a survey essentially that anybody could fill in, and they had to indicate, for example, that they are a resident of Cheltenham. So we were able to capture that. I'm happy to share the report with Councillor Harvey, and if you want to reserve your right in terms of making comments until you've seen that report. But it's a mix. There were some residents who said they preferred, and I think from what I recall, the slightly older demographic preferred saloon vehicles because they were easier to get into and out of. But obviously people with, and we did ask people to try to break down the type of disability they had, just so that we can get a bit of understanding the context of what people were saying. So clearly, if you wheelchair bound, you're clearly going to say we'd need more WAVs. So there wasn't a clear sort of split. It was a fairly mixed, but generally, I think the feeling was that there were a proportion of people who preferred not to travel in a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and there were people who clearly needed to and supported the idea of a WAV fleet.
Come back, Chair, please. I would appreciate seeing a copy of the report, please, because my other daughter's also disabled and she falls into the category of not using a wheelchair. So her disability is not visible and she can get into any vehicle. The analogy I often use about access to wheelchair accessible vehicles is from COVID, actually, when a lot of foods had problems getting into the shops, and people that would ordinarily eat meats and so forth would just go and have whatever's available, which if it was vegan or vegetarian, they didn't mind. They just put sauces on it to make the flavour different. Well, my eldest is a vegan, my youngest is a vegetarian. That caused a problem for us and me as the shopper, because people that can eat meat will eat anything. People that who are vegans and vegetarians can't do that. It's a poor analogy, but it's effective with the taxi rides as well. If we've got a mixed fleet, then somebody that is wheelchair bound it's just going to be hopeful that there is a vehicle available to take them home. Not preserving my right to comment, but I would like it just in the record. It's tough enough getting around when you're in a wheelchair. It's tougher if you can't immediately. I liked the policy as we tried to implement in 2020. I was actually chair of council and mayor in 21 in the town hall during COVID when the policy was postponed for a wait and see. I think the policy's gone backwards. So I'm going to place on record, if I might, my reservations for the current. It's not a criticism of anybody. I understand. I trust you've done all the consultation you need to do, but I still have reservations about general access for people who are in a wheelchair, because I understand not all disabilities are obvious, but wheelchairs are different. They are. So I could just have those thoughts recorded, please. I just have concerns about it.
Thank you. Councillor Steinhardt.
Thank you. There was just a comment in the report about CCTVs, and it said to be encouraged. In this day and age of CCTVs everywhere, and certainly we've had people come into this committee of taxi drivers who haven't had CCTVs and they've had to prove what has happened. What reason is it for not saying mandatory, and is it a financial one or is it some other reason?
That policies and development. So we have a county-wide licensing officers group called GLOG, Gloucestershire Licensing Officers Group, and collectively we're trying to come up with a policy. It is an incredibly complicated area of work with the Information Commissioner, and the county council already have a mandatory CCTV policy in place for all the school contract work, so we need to make sure that whatever our input requirements are aligns with theirs, because we don't want drivers to have multiple systems. So, Cabinet has already given us approval to sort of pursue this, but it's quite a complicated area of work, but it is in development, and I expect next year probably come to Cabinet and this committee for further discussion. So it's not that we're not doing it, it is just, it's just taking a bit long because it's quite complicated.
And Councillor Wheeler.
It was, I think our policy at the moment, having a mixed fleet, is a good one. I've listened to wheelchair users, I've listened to taxi drivers, reluctantly maybe, but I've listened to taxi drivers and wheelchair users, and even some wheelchair users that say they prefer not to actually use a WAV vehicle, but that's besides. So I think the idea of a balanced fleet is good. My question is that as time goes on, those taxi drivers that are using saloon vehicles as opposed to WAV vehicles, are they not going to sort of grow out? And so all new taxi drivers, and therefore we won't then have a mixed fleet, it will be all WAV vehicles, or are there plans afoot to make sure we keep that balance?
At 352 of the report, members will see that we are aiming for a fully wheelchair accessible vehicle fleet by 1st of January 2030. And 2030 because it aligns with our ambition as council for being carbon neutral by 2030. So part of this process is getting our fleet also to a carbon neutral position. So we're working from now to January 2030 to get our fleet to a fully wheelchair accessible, carbon neutral fleet for the taxis out there. So it is something that we're working towards. So this is to some extent an interim position whilst we transition our fleet, because, for example, a London style black cab that is a battery powered is £70,000-80,000 investment. We just don't have the market or the charging infrastructure in Cheltenham at the moment to support a fully, for example, electric fleet of taxis. So we are working towards the ambition of a fully wheelchair accessible fleet by 2030, but in the interim years, we need to obviously do a lot of work around the infrastructure and hopefully taxis, wheelchair accessible taxis, battery powered will become more, affordable and make it more, sustainable for. And generally speaking, on a national level, the trend is that the number of taxis around the country are plummeting. People preferring to use private hire vehicles because of the app capability. Who's picking you up. There's a record of the payment, the record of the journey. At the moment, you can walk up to a taxi rank, stand in the rain, wait for a taxi, and you give them cash, and there's no record of. So there's lots of dynamics at play nationally and locally, but as you'll see from the report, the policy aims to get our fleet to a wheelchair accessible fleet by 2030, 100% wheelchair accessible fleet by 2030, because we recognise the issues that Councillor Harvey raised in this policy consultation. So that's the proposal as outlined in the report.
I'll go Councillor Sankey, and then I'll bring you back in, Councillor Harvey.
Speak on call, Dave, don't worry.
Thank you. I think it's great. Thank you. Really pleased about the safeguarding and the DBS situation. I just have a query, and this might be linked to something else, but I just wanted to clarify it. Is there an expectation with a taxi driver, if something was to happen in between the DBS being checked, that they would have to report that to you? If there's an allegation made or something that happened that could impact DBS, is there an expectation they would have to report that?
Absolutely, and it doesn't need to be a police charge or a police, just an allegation. A police allegation, for example, would be enough to trigger that. So our policy already makes provision for reporting of that type of information to the council. I think within days, I can't remember exactly, but fairly immediately. And we've had plenty of examples of that coming to the committee, where the committee has taken licences away purely based on charges or, you know, or allegations even. So, yeah, we're fairly robust. I'm confident we're fairly robust on that process.
Lovely, thank you.
Councillor Harvey.
It's just a point about wheelchairs, because there are two types of wheelchair. There are what I describe as manual wheelchairs, and some disabled people use those, and they can be put up adjacent to any vehicle and get into the vehicle, and that wheelchair can be folded up, the footrest taken off, and it can be put in the boot of the car. With a 170 kilogram electric motorised wheelchair, you can't do that. And I just think it's important that when we're discussing WAVs and wheelchairs and because I think 2 or 3 years ago in a discussion, I heard talk of, put the wheelchair in the boot. You can't put 170 kilograms of electric wheelchair in the boot of a car because you can't pick it up, for starters. So that's why wheelchair accessible vehicles with ramps at the side or at the back, ours is a backloading, my daughter just drives in. Just wanted to make that distinction on the record that you've got manual chairs where users can alight with help or sometimes by themselves into a regular saloon vehicle. If you're an electric chair, you don't have that option. And we need to understand that.
So I'll add my comments now. So running through the bullet list, I'm really glad that we're going to add a section for comments so that people can add compliments about taxi drivers, because I think as a licensing committee, we only see drivers against whom there have been complaints. And I'm sure there are a lot of very good taxi drivers out there and good private hire drivers, and it would be nice to be able to recognise some of what they do. So that's a really positive thing. Another member of GLOG, who I hope we will be welcoming to Cheltenham, mentioned something called Taxi Plus, and I don't know whether we've looked at that for the DBS checks. That might be something we can add. Shall I do these point by point?
Yeah, that's a quick response. Taxi Plus is basically a third-party commercial company that essentially does some of that checking on behalf of local authorities. It doesn't change the level of check or anything. It just does it for local authorities. So at the moment, we're managing it through Powers Council, who does it for us. So, but in effect, they do the same thing, just not on a commercial basis.
Thanks. In terms of the taximeter tests, where we said you're only doing the tests at the start, and when they're recalibrated for a new fare card, it might also be worth having that option in the policy if there is an obvious concern, i.e. if you're getting lots of complaints that this vehicle seems to be overcharging, that you probably want something in the policy to allow us to do that. The aerodynamic roof signs is obviously a very positive thing in terms of carbon reduction, given that most of our fleet is petrol or diesel based, and so that is a positive. The safeguarding, again, I think that's really important. Certainly I'm aware of an issue where I think if private hire operators had been more aware of safeguarding, there might have been another referral. I won't go into any more details because obviously that's a very personal matter, but it's a case of just that education may well save someone or lead to a better outcome. So I think getting more people in this industry understanding safeguarding is really good. In terms of card machines, I think it's important that we look at making sure we're not requiring the drivers to have excessive merchant fees in what they're doing. And although I think it's possibly the stereotype, that probably means that we require them to support Visa and MasterCard as the minimum standard, because my understanding, and it could be wrong, is that American Express has much higher merchant fees. And I think as long as you're covering the two standard ones, that probably is the balance of people being able to make the payment versus the cost to the drivers. and obviously it is a cost. In terms of the WAV and the decarbonisation, I was in Gloucestershire County Council's Environment Scrutiny this morning, and I think it would be very much worthwhile GLOG engaging with the Transport Decarbonisation team at the County Council to try and work out what the districts and the Hackney Carriage community require in terms of financial support, charging infrastructure, etc., all of which has to be done by the Highway Authority in order to have that EV support. Because if we aren't aligned, then you're going to have left hands of the county doing one thing and right hands of the district licensing authorities doing another thing, and that's not going to work for the private hire and Hackney Carriage drivers. So I think it's really important we look at that holistically, and I can't force both councils to work together, but I can at least ask that question, and I think it's just important to say I don't see why members would have any objection to doing that. So that's my feedback, but I think a lot of this will be welcomed, especially the clarity about the timescales and the deadlines. So I'll say thank you for good work. Anyone else want to comment? Not seeing any hands. So thank you very much for all of that work, and hopefully that can be fed back in. So agenda item 7. I'm just trying to scroll through. So agenda item 7 is the SEV, so the Sexual Entertainment Venue Policy Review. And I'll remind everybody here, SEV is a sensitive topic for a good number of our constituents. It may be a sensitive topic for people here. Please use neutral language if you're, and things like applicant, objector, premises, activity, licensable activity, when you're trying to describe this, because it's obviously more neutral. And just please think how we'll be perceived by the public in what we're saying. I'll ask Public Protection Team Lead to introduce the report, and then obviously it's time, there's then an opportunity for member feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to make clear from the outset that this report is not currently asking members for any views or opinions on the policy. What we're proposing to do is the policy needs reviewing. The report this evening is just seeking endorsement from the committee on the approach that we want to take in undertaking this review. As part of the review process, there will be an opportunity for the committee to formulate its view on the substantive policy, but that's not what we're asking the committee to do. And we don't want that at this stage, because you might be fettering your discretion further down the process if you play your cards this evening. So as per the recommendations, we're asking the committee to approve the approach at 4.1 to 4.5, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Looking for nominations from the committee in terms of members who may be interested to engage in this process. And then there's just a bit about delegating authority to the head of public protection, just to put all of this in motion. So I appreciate there's some new members on the committee, and you may not be, familiar with the legislation around sexual entertainment venues and the local authorities' role in licensing and regulating sexual entertainment venues. So I'll just take a few minutes just to outline briefly the context, the council's position, why the council's current position is what it is, but on the understanding that, of course, all of this is subject to discussion and subject to change and amendment. So this is really a bit of a, this is where we're at today, but it's under the umbrella that doesn't fetter our discretion, and all of this is subject to change. So in legislation, there's a broad category called sex establishments, and that includes sex shops. So we have one sex shop in Kingsditch, sex cinemas, we don't have any of those, and then sexual entertainment venues, which are traditionally, I guess, you refer to as lap dancing or pole dancing venues. So members may be aware that, of course, we have them licensed in, we have one licensed in, or two licensed in the borough, but they only operate during race week. So we don't have these types of establishments operating, all the time. They tend to be licensed, but only operate as those venues other than outside of race weeks and racing events. They just operate normal pubs and bars and etc. So under the legislation, you need a license if you operate this type of establishment on a frequent basis, so more than once a month, etc. So at 2.3 of the report, premises where lap dancing or other sexual entertainment takes place is exempt from any licensing requirements if the provision of this type of entertainment takes place no more than on 11 occasions in a 12-month period, so essentially no more than 11 months a year. And on those occasions, it can't last for more than 24 hours. So that's a statutory exemption that exists. So if you operate sexual entertainment venue under those circumstances, you don't need a license, you don't need to speak to the council, you don't need to speak to the police, you can just get on with it. If you want to operate this type of establishment more frequently than that, you need to come to the council, you need to have a license. We're regulated, we have got inspection rights, we can enter, inspect, etc., etc. So we have the situation in legislation where you can operate either completely outside of any regulatory control, or you have to come to the council and get a license. The council's current policy, and we have discretion to set a zero limit for the whole borough. So from a policy point of view, we can say we resolve that we won't have any licensed SUVs in the borough. So we can set a zero limit, and then there'll always be a presumption against the grant of such a license. The issue that exists is that if we set a zero limit, operators will essentially just utilise the exemption that exists. And we know this because they've done this in the past, where they would have had 24 hours in one venue and the next night they'll move to a different venue and they'll move around town. So effectively, we'll still have the same amount of sexual entertainment happening, but it's just completely unregulated. There's no protection for performers, for customers. We have no rights of entry, for example. So we have the situation where we can set a zero limit, but it will have no practical effect because we'll still have the same amount, but it will have the significant difference of not being regulated. So our policy position at the moment is that everywhere other than the town centre, mainly, we set a zero limit. So we will not entertain sexual entertainment venue licenses anywhere other than the town centre, recognising that we have this exemption problem and recognising that the town centre's nighttime economy presents a slightly different scenario than our sort of outlying mainly residential areas. And in the town centre, we will determine applications on a case-by-case basis. So the current policy, and this is really what causes much of the discussion and upset and debate, is this issue around whether the council should just set a zero limit and just be done with it. And we're saying, well, actually, that's not going to provide any protections for anybody. We won't see any less sexual entertainment venues, so we prefer to license them and regulate them, which is the best way of doing it. So we have engaged with government, we've engaged with the Local Government Association, we've engaged with the Institute of Licensing, we've had questions in Parliament, trying to get a change in legislation, because once we overcome the sexual entertainment venue exemption issue, then all of the other issues will go away, and then we can have a real discussion around whether a zero limit is what we want for the town. But until that happens, the policy position is that we prefer to license than have this unlicensed. So all of this is up for discussion in the policy review. What we proposed to do, and this is something that we've done in the past, and I think it's worked really well. I think because of lots of issues around equality and lots of issues around women's safety and all of that stuff that we need to take seriously, that we need to take, have a debate, an open debate about. What we propose to do is to set up a number of sort of engagement sessions where we invite objector groups, we invite groups representing women's interests and women's safety. We've got the VOG group, for example, that we already engage with. Religious objectors, so we have, as I say, we have the diocese, we have the Baptist Church, and we have the Salvation Army. They engage in this process quite often, objecting to these types of applications. We've got the police crime commissioner, MPs who've in the past got involved in this as well, operators and performers. So what we propose to do is over a number of sessions, bring people in and listen. I think we're not at this stage looking to provide any opinion or views on it. I think it's just for the committee to listen to what people are saying, understand some of the concerns that they've got, give them a platform to express those concerns, and then we'll come back and then we'll feed that into the discussion with committee and with cabinet as well, so that I think David has been clear that we want to be open, we want to be listening initially, whilst at the outset of this policy review process. So what we're asking members this evening is to vote on approving that approach, or change it if you think that's not the right approach. To nominate, I would say probably 3, maybe 4 members who may want to be part of this process. And then, just delegate authority to me to just put all of this in motion, send invites out, draw up terms of reference, that type of stuff. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So, are there any questions? Councillor Joy.
I would say first and foremost, I think it's good that we're regulating this, because it kind of like creates this baseline of like good practice that we do have oversight over. I was wondering a little bit, because in point 4.3, I just noticed that there may be a couple of stakeholders that could be welcomed into consultations. So I'd be really interested in ensuring, it may come under groups representing women's interests and safety, but I realise that there can be, certain recruitment practices that aren't necessarily very responsible, and I don't know if necessarily that might come under our remit, but I just want to make sure that there isn't any kind of, kind of underhanded recruitment. Do you sort of see what I mean? Like, I kind of, I know that sometimes, like, workers within this particular industry, they can sometimes be moved around and not paid equitably. So it'd be really interesting to, in some ways, include sort of advocacy groups, just to kind of sort of see what the national picture looks like, and just make sure that they're actually being paid effectively, potentially actually given the right kind of workers' rights that they should be entitled to, because that can easily be obscured by kind of like a lot of the, more politicised discussion about this. And I would really, really like to prioritise that. Similarly, I'd also be really interested in making sure that health and safety practices and everything being up to code is actually considered, because a lot of the equipment associated with this needs to be of very, very high standard. It needs to be safe. I think that this is one of the things that I very much kind of take objection with the idea of like a nil policy where we have no involvement whatsoever, because if our inspections can ensure that the equipment is safe to use, that there's proper fire exit and emergency procedure, I just kind of want to make sure that those measures are robust. So if there's any way of including people, like individuals from that, those sort of sectors, would that be feasible at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're open to, we already have people like Grassack, and I think Lost Women is an advocacy group nationally that's got a local branch, and we've got the Ball group. And so we already have some groups that identified that already engage in the process, but that doesn't mean that the door's closed for anything else. So yeah, quite happy to pick that up.
I think there's also some representative groups for performers, probably from Bristol area. I think that's probably the nearest to make sure we're getting that. That might be covered with where we're hearing from performers as well. Councillor Harvey.
Chair, thank you. You just picked up on one of the points I was going to make, which is this committee has taken evidence within the last year from one of the regular performers in Cheltenham. I think it's also worth stating for the record my appreciation for what our public protection team do for these with respect to the venues. One of them, which I don't need to name, has 14 security industry authorised people on duty, protecting both performers, customers, and the building, which is, I think, is I don't want to use the term bouncers, but that's a lot of staff doing that. And I'm very grateful for the inspections that our teams do with the 2 venues that are the main two in Cheltenham. What has concerned me in the past has been the Cheltenham factor of having an informed populace who might be also informed by legally qualified persons as to why Cheltenham Borough Council should or should not be doing something with respect to our policy. So what I think would be really useful for this policy to go forward, the updates to go forward, is we have a very, very clear set of guidance from how the borough interprets the legal position nationally, which seems to be in line with the actual primary legislation, because a lot of people that seem to think that they are better qualified than our protection officers and our legal advisors, and that they're not. They're not actually qualified in anything. They just have an opinion which they express very strongly, and they're entitled to do that. But what happens is the noise that's generated from that actually takes away from a lot of the protections that are in place for anybody using these venues. And I think that's important to understand that just because someone's shouting loudly doesn't mean to say they're necessarily right or are quoting the law correctly. I feel uncomfortable with things I've seen in the past couple of years from learned people making a legal position which is contrary to how the Borough Council interprets it. And I think we need to be a little bit more robust in stating where we are coming from in terms of our interpretation of the legal aspects, because it seems to happen every cycle that someone says you're doing this wrong, you have the powers to do this, you have the powers to do that, you're not exercising and therefore you're not doing it right. And we are. So I just think that needs to be made clear, not just for the committee members, but for the general lay public. And I welcome the likes of GDAS and GRASAC being involved in the consultation. And again, I also welcome the fact that one of the performers has given evidence to this committee, because I think that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. Any more comments, questions from colleagues? So I'll just put a few things. So I think the list that we've got, having been on one of the previous committees that took that evidence, I think it's really useful to get the range of views. And actually, in light of the decision from the court about Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, the ensuring that we show that we are genuine in our consultation and that we're genuinely giving due regard to the public sector equality duty, or it's a genuine consultation where we will listen, is really, really important. And I think I have confidence that officers and members will be aware of that decision, and we're going to do this properly in terms of consultation and listening to people within the scope of the law. I think it's important, if we can, to roll back to the council's pledge to tackle violence against women and girls. And I think it's important within those terms of reference that we look how we can include relevant policies in there, and perhaps in the terms of reference we could make sure that that's covered in some of the questions that we ask people, because I'm not an expert on what you need to do to tackle that, but I think we need to look at what best practice would be and how we might incorporate that into the policy. I think it's really important that we have a calm and informed debate about that, using non-pejorative language, because it's very easy to turn this into a wedge issue and to only focus on one part of it. When you read the legal definition, the performer, the sex of the performer is not specified, the sexual preference of the audience isn't specified, and we need to make sure that what we have, as far as is possible, covers all of those groups, not just the bit where there is, the female performer, male audience, which is what's our primary concern at the moment. One thing it might be useful for me to do, if committee are happy for me to do that, is, since we have a new government, is to write to the Home Secretary stating the challenges we have with the exemption in Cheltenham, and to see whether the new government, have any plans to review the legislation. And at least then we will be better informed as to whether in the next 5 years we're going to need to relook at this policy, or whether the current stance of the previous government is going to carry on. And just to quote, so we wrote to Victoria Atkins in the Home Office in 2020, and the nub of the government not changing the legislation, I'll read from the letter we got back, was: the intent of the legislation is to strike a balance between nuisance to the community and the reduction of onerous regulation being placed on small businesses, which was to do with the exemption. So if members are happy, I will draft something up to the Home Secretary, because it's unclear who is responsible for this policy in government, and then we can see. We also need to work out who is going to go on the group that's going to take evidence. And I don't know whether we want to look for volunteers now, or whether we want to do that by email later with the dates being known. So any thoughts on that, people? Councillor Wheeler. Do we have everybody's diary? Councillor Wheeler, sorry. Okay. It would be good to have you, Councillor Joy, because that means at least it's cross-party. Yeah. And shall we look at sending stuff out by email to try and get a group that's a sensible size, and to look
I'll
at
confirm the provisional dates and times.
confirm the provisional dates. And are we happy that I write to the Home Secretary, get that back to a future meeting, so it's an open letter? So does anyone else want to add anything? Not seeing any hands. Louis? No? Right. Item 8 says review of previous decisions. Sorry, I've just got to pop up. Hang on. Right. There's nothing in my bundle about that. Item 9 is any other decision that the chairman determines is urgent and requires a decision. You'll be glad to know there are none. And item 10 is the date of the next meeting, which will be the 4th of December 2024. And since that's in the Christmas period, perhaps after that meeting we would look to have a practical application of licensing to recognise everybody's work throughout the year. And with that, what is it, 5 to 7, I will close the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance this evening.